What's going on, Free Pours? We're here today in Belfast, and I'm extremely excited for this interview. I'm a big history buff. I love reading. And I especially love traveling and speaking to people who have actually been through the events that I've read about. So today we have Joe Austin. Joe, how are you doing?
I'm grand.
Great, great. So I would love to hear all about the troubles, the conflicts, all of the things that as Americans all over the world, we see on TV, but we don't really know much about,
Okay.
Well, there's shows where we see, the real IRA and things like that, and sometimes in a historical context, but we don't really know much about it. So whatever you can tell us, that'd be amazing.
Well, welcome to Belfast.
Thank
That's
you.
the first thing and the most important thing.
Happy to be here.
We're in West Belfast. Belfast is a very small city, as you probably have appreciated.
Yeah.
Certainly in comparison to the size of some of the cities in your own country, it's tiny. This part of Belfast has a population of just over 120,000 people. Historically, many of the events that you've asked me about, both in the past conflict, happened in this immediate area. It's known as the Gale-Topped Quarter. And just over my shoulder, there's a football match taking place. It's taking place in an Irish language college, the largest Irish language college in the world. It has, I think, 900 pupils who are learning their education through the medium of the Irish language. But this is a very important place as a starting point to try and explain to an audience what led to the conflict and where the conflict is going to lead us all to, hopefully. So Ireland was England's first colony. 900 years ago, Britain decided that it needed to expand its territorial claims. It needed to expand them for a variety of reasons, for economic growth, for political power, for natural resources. And they came to Ireland because we're quite close to England. And they'd done a number of things. First of all, they colonised the land. Those who were on the land were displaced, the native Irish were displaced, and the land was then given to people who had a similar political view to the colonies, England's colonies. And they then became almost like the caretakers of this land that wasn't theirs, but they occupied, and they looked after the land in the interest of the British. So Ireland's a very green country. And I'm sure you've noticed that since you've been here.
Absolutely.
But there's very few trees. So why does Ireland not have forests? And the reason that Ireland doesn't have forests was in the 16th century, the British cut all the trees down to make warships, to make slave ships, to make the ships that would run the economy. So Ireland was seen, not the only place in the world, but Ireland was seen as a colonial resource. From that time, 900 years, you just think of that, 900 years. There has been conflict in Ireland around the ownership of Ireland. Irish Republicans, and I have to say not an American version of Republicans, but Irish Republicans, radical political thinkers, believe that Ireland belongs to the Irish nation, to do with as they see fit, to organise as they wish. But to organise in the interests of Ireland, not in the interests of anyone else or any other country. And that has led to a whole host of difficulties. It's led to conflict every 10 years for 900 years. This is what you've seen in television in the last 20 or 30 or 40 years is a repeat of a story that happened 100, 200, 300 years ago. So it was like a bad playing LP that kept going back and kept going back. And all of that led to the conflict that redeveloped in August 1969, and it happened here in Belfast. But it has its roots in your country.
Does it?
Yeah, because people of my generation would have grown tired of this repetitive conflict. We'd have gone tired of kind of going back to the same issues time and time again, the issues that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers had. And it coincided with the invention of television, or at least the promotion of television. And as a young man in 1967, 66, I turned on television and I watched these people in a place called America who were marching for civil rights. And I watched people talk about the values that they had, that I also believed in. And I watched charismatic leaders like Malcolm X, like you know, Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, people like that who were articulating a demand from a people who had been depraved, discriminated against, marginalised, mistreated economically, put into poverty, and I thought that was me. The difference was the colour, but the issues were the same. So what happened was we then decided, if you're on TV, you're going to win. So if people in Selma, Alabama are walking and they're being beaten and dogs are eating them and all of that's happening, if we do a bit of that, surely the world will see that we also have a case, that we also have injustice, and that if they see it, they'll fix it. Now, that was a very naive and a very foolish view, but nevertheless, that's how we've seen things. So we formed, as a direct mimic of what was happening in your own country, we formed the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. And we walked for jobs, for housing, for one person, one vote, for the right to have a legislator who will reflect the needs of us. And what happened in Ireland is what had happened for all those years. That once you begin to rock the boat, once you begin to challenge the system will respond in a violent way. And that's exactly what happened. And it happened in this area. It happened within a radius of a half a mile from where we're sitting. And I think that reflects our naivety. It reflects the view that injustice will be resolved if only people knew that there was injustice. And it isn't like that. That isn't what happens in this big world. Injustice is there for a reason, and to remove it is more difficult than just simply saying, this isn't right. And that act of violence by the state to try and suppress those demands led us to, unfortunately, over 40 years of war. It led us to the death of 3,000 people, led us to the injuries of 300 people, led to misery, to heartache, to heartbreak, not only on the island of Ireland, but also in England, a country that should be our best friend, that has been our enemy for all these years. And you asked me a question earlier on, which I thought was quite important. Peace is not the absence of violence. Peace is the absence of the reasons for violence. And when you have the reasons for violence that prevail, you don't have peace. You have peace on hold.
Right.
Yeah. And so a lot of the problems that we've had over the years still exist. A lot of them are resolved, but at least at this point in time, there is an alternative way of resolving them. Some of the groups that you mentioned, the real IRA, don't exist. I mean, they exist in the minds of a handful of people. They don't have any political influence. They don't have any military force. They have no effect on progress or lack of progress. I think they cause problems for everybody, but a bad peace is better than no peace.
So someone I spoke to had a theory. He said that there is going to be a referendum probably in about 10 or 20 years that he sees, because he says the Catholics are outbreeding the Protestants in Northern Ireland. So he believes that in the future there will be like a peaceful referendum, and then everyone will vote to unify Ireland. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me make this clear. I'm not a Catholic.
Okay.
And my breeding days are long gone. So there's two strikeouts. Now, let me make this clear. Unionism or loyalism or Protestantism has fears that are genuine. They're not made up. They're not in their heads. They're real fears. My responsibility as someone who's looking for an alternative to conflict is to address those fears. So how do you address the fears? You address the fears by talking out what the fears are. You address them by creating a legal framework where the fears can be legislated for. So the referendum that you're speaking about, what we're suggesting and what is now, I suppose, the inevitability of it, is that a referendum decides, with everybody's participation, what is required to create a new Ireland, what you need to safeguard your fears, what you need to protect your way of life. Unionism is those people who believe that their future lies in a British way of life. as opposed to the Irish who believe that it lies within the island of Ireland. The two things can live hand in hand. They're not mutually exclusive. They can survive, but you need to have a framework which they are surviving. Now, that framework is the referendum that decides, will there be a new Ireland, and if there is a new Ireland, what is it going to look like? What's it going to be? What kind of new Ireland can win the support of the most people that live on the end?
It sounds to me, based on what you're suggesting, and what you said, is perhaps a united Ireland, but one that remains very, very close ties with the UK.
Well, we live 22 miles away. You know, although we have a different, Republicans would have a different political ideology from what exists at the moment, certainly, in England. But we need to be friends with our neighbours. We can't, in perpetuity, be at war, I hope. So what we need to do is work out what makes peace a likelihood. And as I said earlier on, peace isn't something that you arrive at and you stop. Peace is something that you have to feed. You know, Black Lives Matter, for instance. You can have all the legislation you want that talks about equality, but you see, unless people are working for equality, the legislation doesn't mean anything. So here, what we're suggesting is that we need a framework whereby all of those views, and people are quite entitled to describe themselves as British. I'm Irish, but people can describe themselves however they want. And I need to protect that description, just the same way that those who describe themselves as British need to understand that my identity is as precious as their identity. So it works both ways. If you're asking me, I know you're going to ask me it, because I know it's a trick question, you're going to try and get me. Is this going to happen? Yes, it is going to happen. When's it going to happen? I don't know. But I know that it's happening in like baby steps every day.
Is there any event that kind of sticks out to you in terms of a very heavy-handed British response, sort of like maybe Bloody Sunday?
Well, there are many events that have happened right across this conflict that have left a lasting memory. Bloody Sunday was 1971, January 1971. But prior to Bloody Sunday, there had been a similar event in Belfast in an area called Ballymurphy, where 10 civilians were killed by a regiment of the British Army that went on within a month to Derry to Bloody Sunday, and they killed civilians. And it was a strategy and a policy that the British government had enacted. They had realised that they weren't able to defeat the IRA, much like the American government realised they couldn't defeat the Viet Cong. If you create that weariness, then what you're able to do is you're able to drain the ability of the IRA to fight, or perhaps get them to voluntarily or involuntarily go into the ceasefire mode or whatever. So Bloody Sunday was one of those events. I think if you fast forward that until 1981, the hunger strike, the 1980 hunger strike, there were two hunger strikes, the 1980 hunger strike and 1981 hunger strike, which is the one that made famous by the deaths of the 10 men, particularly Bobby Sands. I think that was another watershed moment.
Can you explain that a little bit?
1970 to 1979 had afforded those who were captured and who were Republicans and who were some loyalists as well, they had afforded them a category that said, you're not criminals, you're in jail for an offence, but you're not criminals, so we're not going to treat you as ordinary criminals. You're not going to be breaking rocks or sewing mail bags or making number plates. You can study, you can wear your own clothes. The prison regime has been run by the prison authorities, but within that, you can educate yourself, and that's what Republicans did do. They also tried to escape on a very regular basis. The British government decided that created a bad image, particularly in your own country. So the jail that they chose this battle to be in was a jail that had been previously called Long Cash. So they announced on a Monday morning, Long Cash is closed. We now have a new jail, and the new jail is called the Maze. And everybody who's in the Maze will act like ordinary decent criminals and will do what we tell them to do. That was never going to happen. So Republicans were being told they had to wear a prison uniform. They had to comply to very menial work, literally like sewing mail bags and stuff like that. A young man who was a friend of mine, an 18-year-old man called Kieran Nugent, on the morning he was sentenced, said, I'm not a convict, and I won't wear a convict uniform. And if you want me to wear that uniform, you'll have to put it on my back with nails, because I'm not going to wear it. And he didn't, and he started what was called the blanket protest. He was naked for the period of his imprisonment. Bobby Sands was a young man who was the officer commanding Republican prisoners in this particular jail. There had been a hunger strike in 1980. It looked like the hunger strike would end with no deaths and that the demands within reason of the prisoners and a compromise would be met. The British government reneged on it at the very last moment, and a second hunger strike in 1981 began. And that hunger strike led to 10 men dead in prison and led to 40 people dead outside of the prison.
Do you have any personal stories about?
I have millions of personal stories, but I involve myself in politics rather than personalities.
Yeah. Any like events you were involved in, or anyone like there's someone named Mo Boston, you know?
Well, no. Yeah, well, I mean, I've been involved in politics for many, many years and done many things in politics. So probably the thing that would strike me the most is that during the hunger strike, during the 1981 hunger strike, my job from a Republican perspective was to visit the prisoners who were going on hunger strike and visit the prisoners who were on hunger strike during that period. So you kind of way where you were in the company of men, and there also were some women in the 1980 hunger strike, but in the 1981 hunger strike it was all men, of meeting people who had taken a decision that they would sacrifice themselves for the common good of other prisoners. Many of those who died knew they were going to die. So my job was to tell them that. My job was to go into the prison and to say this is not really a good idea. The hunger strike was a decision taken completely by the prisoners. It was begun by the prisoners and it was stopped by the prisoners. The demands that the British had sent in were ratified, were accepted by the prisoners. But my job was to meet those men and to tell them, like, the inevitability of your action is your death. And so I would have met Bobby Sands and people and the other hunger strikers. And that's a very humbling experience when whatever the politics, whatever the cause, wherever it's happening, where you meet people who are so committed to bringing about change. And the change they were looking for was very minimal. To bringing about change, it is a humbling and a life-changing experience. So that I've had friends who have died in the conflict. I have survived a number of assassinations, some at my home, some just in the street. And all of that, it's a life well lived. It's many ways to describe my life, but you'll never describe it as being born. That's for definite.
These assassination attempts, any idea which group facilitated it?
Well, they were carried out by the Loyalists, but they were sponsored by the British.
Wow.
I lived at one stage I lived quite close to here, and there were, my wife was away on a lecture, a speaking tour, and there was grenades thrown through the window. Another attempt was I was the editor of a local paper for a while, a local political paper, on my way to open the office, and there was another attempt. I had met by chance a number of people and was walking with them on the sidewalk. One was shot dead and 3 were injured, and I survived.
So you mentioned the civil rights in the Americans. We have a lot of heroes. What are your heroes for?
Oh, there are many heroes.
Yeah.
I mean, heroes in Ireland and heroes in your own country and heroes overseas. I suppose the heroes of any conflict are the people who aren't called heroes. They're the people who go to marches, who take part in marches, who aren't known, the people who refuse to say No, people who won't be broken. It's all of that. It's the men and women who believe in change. Che Guevara, we have him somewhere here, is a hero of mine. He's obviously, his family background is that he's Irish, Ernesto Che Guevara Lynch. Many heroes, Malcolm X. Recently in Belfast, I met Angela Davies. I don't know why you know who Angela Davies is or was. She is a black American activist who was at one stage in the late 60s, early 70s, was declared public enemy #1. I met her here in Belfast. She was here to speaking to her. I tend not to be impressed by people who have titles, but it's the deed rather than title. And overseas, I would have many heroes. But I'm not fixated with heroes.
Personally, I believe, like, for example, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, I was out of the country. I'm usually outside of the country.
It sounds good. That's very convenient.
Yeah.
You're out of the country and I'm not allowed out of the country. There's something not right there.
Yeah. But I see these protesters, right? So these people who are going out to march and protest. And I'm in awe because I know personally I'm not doing that. I know exactly what's going to occur at those things. And there's a level of bravery that is required, that feeling that you are going to sacrifice or put yourself in danger to protest, for change and to think things are right. It's, I could say personally, I don't have it in me. I'm like, I see that, I'm like, the cops are over there, they're beating people, there's all sorts of guns and maces, and I'm out, But I have a lot of respect for people who can do that because those are the people who drive change.
Well, I don't know you well enough to say you're right or you're wrong. But I believe that in the human spirit, there is a sense, in all human spirits, there is a sense of what's right and what's wrong. I think many people take a decision that it ain't their fight, it isn't their battle, it isn't for them, and they try to remain neutral. I think every so often you come into contact with someone who thinks every battle is their battle, and I think you come into contact sometimes with people through an affinity, through an identification, through something that sparks off within the human being that this isn't right. And that's the feeling that I had as a young man who wasn't a Republican, who didn't come from a Republican family. In fact, I came from a family that was economically quite comfortable, but who seen a grainy black and white footage of Selma, Alabama, and dogs eating people, biting people, and women getting knocked over with men with cudgels and all of that. And that was my fight. Now, that's what made me a Republican. Not we're in the James Connolly Centre, and it's a beautiful building, and we're surrounded by all kinds of books that would reflect Connolly and reflect Irish politics. I'm a Republican because what I seen happening in America, that's what made me a Republican. Now, I built on it, I developed it, I brought it to a sense of here, I done all of that there. I don't believe that you wouldn't take part in a demonstration. I don't believe you wouldn't stand up. I don't believe that you would turn the other way. But I think the issue has to be the issue that hits that button in your soul. So that's it. We live in a world that is frightening on many occasions. But we also live in a world where you see tremendous bravery. You see people who have everything to lose and very little to gain, standing up and saying, no, not in my name. I became addicted to American television, and particularly CNN, and it was around Donald Trump. And I couldn't even when I wasn't working, I was recording it, and I was trying to get a sense of what was happening in America, trying to get a sense of the peace process that we both spoke about here wouldn't be here if it wasn't for American intervention. We may have had a later peace process, we may have had something that was similar, but it was American intervention that put pressure on the British government to deliver peace. And the idea that that force will help to deliver peace in Ireland, but is silent over the issues that affect its own citizens. How Donald Trump can be elected is beyond me. And the fear that he'll be elected again is beyond me. So I think the question that you ask, I think it's not a lack of bravery, it's a lack of identity. When the issue is right, when the time is right, when it affects your own value system, when it affects you, I would say you'll be there. I grew up around Bob Dylan, and I grew up around songs like The Times Are Changing and Blowing in the Wind and so on. And I heard recently Joan Baez doing an interview. Joan Baez is an American folk singer. Mm-hmm. And she said, Bob Dylan never went to a civil rights march in his life. I went, and he asked me questions about it. So I think it's the issue rather than the bravery of people.
One of my biggest philosophies, right, and one reason why I'm such a history buff is because I believe that it is absolutely essential to know what happened in the past so that you don't repeat the same mistakes in the future.
Okay.
The past, even though it had already happened, right, that's still mistakes that humanity has made already. Mistakes and triumphs that you can use to shape your present and your future. And you had mentioned Trump. One of the biggest things for me has been, there was a Netflix special, I can't remember what it's called, but basically it's, and World War II is a big subject of mine as well,
yeah.
But it went into such detail about the men who supported Adolf Hitler, right? And in a detail that I had never heard before. And hearing how, the Heinrich Himmler, all of the Joseph Goebbels, all of those people who contributed to his rise. And you're watching this thing and you're like, man, this seems awfully familiar. This seems like happening right now. These people who are, they have a lot of personality, right? A lot of intelligence and drive, propping up someone who has absolutely no business being there. And it's scary. It's scary.
Well, we talked earlier on about this button that's in people that makes them respond to injustice. There are some people, I think, who have an alternative button, mm-hmm. and that button is self-interest. Mm. And they're the people who will justify anything, providing out of what they're justifying, there's some return, whether it's ego, finance, whatever. And that they exist. I mean, there is an expression that a Lutheran minister during the Second World War, seeing you brought up the Second World War, he was in a prison camp that was there for political prisoners, and as well as the Holocaust, which we should never forget, there were also sections of prisoners who were there because they were gay, because they were socialists, because they were communists, because they were trade unionists, because they were wherever. This Lutheran prisoner, pastor, he was a prisoner, was there because he wouldn't preach the Nazi gospel. And he wrote a letter saying, they came for the socialists and I didn't protest because I'm not a socialist. And they came for the homosexuals and I didn't protest because I ain't a homosexual. And it came the night for me and there's nobody left to protest.
So you mentioned that the resistance or the Republic, they also had some mistakes made as well. Can you expand upon that? Like, what would be something that's like stands out as something that was really, really major?
Well, listen, Chris, it would be foolish to believe that all the bad things in a 40-year plus conflict happened because of the British. And so it is foolish to believe that in a 40-year war that the methods that the IRA used were all justified. It's foolish to believe that myself included, I'm not saying this is the property of others, that we hurt people. We are collectively responsible for suffering, for sacrifice. We're not only responsible for it, but that's something that I think Republicans, when we talk about a new Ireland, is something that Republicans, as well as the British, need to say, okay, this is what we done. How do we make it better? Is it possible? So, and I said it very consciously, I think I've said it twice, but I'll say it again. See, peace isn't the absence of violence, it's the absence of the reasons for violence. And you need to tackle those reasons for violence. And you need to tackle those reasons in a way that allows people to feel that their voice has been heard and their opinion means something and that their way of life is protected.
To conclude this interview, is there any message that you'd like to get across, something that you'd like the audience to know?
Well, there's a whole lot of messages, I suppose. But you have to have a sense that Ireland is part of a bigger jigsaw and that you can't talk about equality in Ireland. You can't talk about fairness in Ireland. You can't talk about democracy in Ireland and be blind to other democracies or others who seek democracy which has been denied. Injustice done to one is injustice done to us all. And I think we're approaching, the next time you come home, you come back here. And that's one of the curses of Ireland. People keep coming back. But the next time you come back, there'll be another change. And it'll be a change in society. And that's wonderful. But we need to use art. We need to use that as a way of helping others in a global sense who are also seeking an end to injustice. So, you know, I'm glad that to have an opportunity to have an opinion, to be able to be speaking to you. Many people around the world, in Palestine, in Catalonia, and other countries who have an opinions aren't heard. So thank you for allowing me to indulge.
And thank you for sharing your story, your experiences, and enlightening us on what happened in Ireland and the best path forward for its future.
Thank you.
This has been an honor. I much appreciate it.
Well, no, thank you. Thank
All
you.
right, cheers.